Hi, I'm Jenny, and in today's video I want to get to the bottom of my previous statement, why women don't like watches, how it happened, and why things are definitely changing. So let's get started. Since I've started uploading my videos to YouTube, I've got so many people saying that they are happy to finally see a woman talk about watches in this heavily male-dominated hobby. And though I am by far not the only or even the first female that has entered the watch space online or offline, I mean, look at Cara from Hodinkee or Anna from Theo and Harris. There are also Kat and Catelyn from the 10 and 2 podcast, as well as so many other female enthusiasts and collectors and professionals working in the watch industry. But still, the perception remains that women are super rare to come by when it comes to the watch hobby, and I have to agree with that. I'm sure that less ladies are part of this hobby than gentlemen. So I decided to finally put my degree to good use, do some research and see if I can find out why that is, how it came to be, and what implications these findings have for myself and for you. I have divided this video into the following parts to explore the background of this issue so we can arrive at the current time. First, I want to bring you back to the olden days so we have a good overview of the origin of the wristwatch, how it developed over time, and who got to wear them. For part 2, I want to look at the commercial journey of watches and how watch manufacturers got us to buy their products. In part 3, we're going to contrast our findings to the psychology of consumer behavior to see how different marketing messages to different people can paradoxically result in rather homogeneous consumer groups. And last but not least, I'm also going to throw my 2 cents in. It is documented that the first wristwatches were primarily worn by women, whereas men used to wear mostly pocket watches until the 20th century. There's been some discussion about when exactly women started to wear wristwatches, but there are accounts of Queen Elizabeth I receiving a clock that is intended to be worn on the wrist by Robert Dudley in 1571, and a few centuries later in 1790, an account book of Jacques Dreux and Le Show of Genève mention a watch to be fixed to a bracelet, and in 1809 Empress Josephine presented her daughter-in-law with 2 bracelets, in which one also contained a watch and the other one a calendar. By far one of the most famous of the early women's watches was the one commissioned by the Queen of Naples from watchmaker Breguet in 1810, followed by the key winding ladies bracelet watch from the Countess of Hungary in 1868. So basically, women have been wearing wristwatches for centuries, whereas men relied on pocket watches worn on a small chain to be able to tell the time. As with most things, the biggest changes happen in the face of conflict or problems. I mean, the selfie stick was finally solving the painful problem of not being able to take proper, cringy and touristy selfies in front of our favorite holiday landmark. And so during the 19th century, when the amount of conflict and wars in the world increased, the need for precisely timing military actions came up. And as troop movement and maneuver had to be timed or communicated without giving the strategy away to the enemy, soldiers started to use their pocket watches, but obviously not the most convenient thing on the battlefield, trying to constantly fumble out your pocket watch whilst holding your weapon. All this led to the creation of wristlets, or pocket watches that were being placed in a special leather case with a strap attached so you could just wear it around your arm. And at that time, and we're talking about the late 19th century, we get to the first sort of crossroads situation in the journey of wristwatches and the gender of people who wore them. On the one hand, you still got the watches attached to nice jewelry-like bracelets, which were worn mostly by women, but there was also the wristwatch as a tool, which was basically a pocket watch held by a leather strap, which was worn by military men, soldiers and aviators, etc. as tools. But it did take some time for the wristwatch to gain a proper standing amongst the male population, as it was mostly seen as a tool that was connected to the lower classes, and fancy people still relied on their fancy watches to tell the time. But by the time of the First World War, the wristwatch, now more than ever before, proved itself not only as a convenient and practical item, but also as an absolutely vital item during military maneuvers. And proof of that is, for example, a book published during the war in 1916, and it's called Knowledge of the War: Every Officer Officer's Handbook for the Front by Captain B.C. Lake of the King's Own Scottish Borderers that included a luminous wristwatch with unbreakable glass as one of the top things on the must-have list. And so when the war ended and the lucky ones made it home alive, they were still wearing their trusted wristwatches. Civilians got used to seeing these battle-hardened veterans with their watches, and wristwatches quickly lost their reputation for being perhaps not something a man would wear. But here's the thing, wristwatches became the accessory or tool of professions that pretty much excluded most women. I mean, historically, being a soldier was a man's job, and same goes for being an aviator, with very few exceptions, and many other professions as well. Women's watches got stuck in the jewelry or accessory phase because given a woman's role in society at those times meant that there was simply no real opportunity for women to use watches as tools, as they, depending on their status in society, would work jobs that wouldn't necessarily require precise timekeeping. They would be working in factories, on farms, they'd be housewives, etc. And so throughout the 20th century, unsurprisingly, things didn't change much. A woman's role in society remained largely the same up until the women's rights movement during the 60s and 70s started the second wave of feminism, which came after the first wave during the 19th and early 20th century, which was largely focused on women's legal rights, like the right to vote, for example. Emancipation for women happened very slowly over decades and is still an ongoing battle, but at least for most women right now, it is possible to be a soldier, fly an airplane, be a scientific explorer, and so on, and use watches as a proper tool for their everyday work and private life. So now, after all this time going through all the change in society, how did the watch industry change with it? As I've mentioned earlier, wristwatches came to a crossroad where you had feminine and dainty wristwatches on the one side and masculine tool wristwatches on the other side. To answer that question, we are going to switch over to part 2 and check how the industry's answer looks to the decades of societal change. Okay, so now that we know how wristwatches ended up on our wrist in a historical sense, I thought the best way to check for clues as to why we have less women than men in this hobby is to look at how watches have been marketed over time. It's where the special dynamics of the watch hobby come into play. Watches or the hobby tend to, I don't say it has to be that way, but is oftentimes heavily focused on consuming, or better said, buying products. I mean, clearly there is an item or product attached to the hobby that costs money. It is different to sports like, I don't know, running, for example. Runners compare timing, they compare distance or speed, and yes, they do buy equipment for the hobby, but it's not really the main focus, I would say. So I think it will offer very valuable clues if we compare and contrast how watchmakers or brands advertise their products to their two consumer groups, male and female, over the past century up until today. So for this time, we can see that they started out advertising watches in the 20th century with a more or less unisex approach in the time up to the 1920s. Though some adverts clearly target men, there are also women included, like this one from Omega. The lady and the gentleman appear equal, and I would say that there's no clear indication of which one of the watches displayed around the pair are ladies or men's watches. When going through the Roaring 20s and approaching World War II, we can see how there is a clear change in marketing. Since the time required watches to be more of a tool than a fashionable accessory, adverts are clearly focused on the male experience, whereas ads for ladies' watches definitely push the jewelry aspect a lot more. Moving forward, and definitely influenced by the use and significance of watches during the war, we start to see a very clear trend emerging. The trend of making wristwatches the symbol of manliness or masculinity. Watches are represented as essential items for the manly man, the alpha male. Getting certain watches from certain brands starts to say something about you as a man or person, and you basically just have to choose a certain message. At the same time, we see the designated ladies' watches are not only looking more and more like teeny tiny bracelets, but they're also something a woman doesn't necessarily buy for herself but gets as a present. Not really surprising, as during that time a woman had little control over their income when married. There are obviously exceptions to that, and I did find a very cool advert from 1954 from Timex that feels surprisingly modern and equal. Timex speaks of active people, showing male and female athletes who would wear a Timex watch. Right around the 60s up until the 80s, we don't see much change in watch adverts, though the women's rights movement is in full swing at the time. We don't see much of that in the watch industry. To be fair, the overall style of ads has changed too. We see so much more adverts that focus on the watch only, as cameras and photography and printing in general evolved, which allowed them to showcase their details on their watches much better. But the message remains. Wristwatches are a tool for manly men. I mean, look at this 1974 Rolex ad for a Lady Datejust. Even the ad for a ladies' watch is clearly targeted to men. The perspective is a male perspective. I mean, sadly at the time, those were still the ones who were largely able to buy wristwatches after all, as the gender pay gap was much bigger than it is now. But let's fast forward to today. Though watchmakers have toned down the sexism in their ads, it's still there. Women are often displayed as super sexy whilst wearing their watch. The outfit is mostly accentuating her body shape, showing off the typical Western beauty standard, whilst seductively staring at the viewer. She doesn't really do much with the watch. It's portrayed as an accessory to her. Watches marketed to men are shown to be of use to a man. In my Q&A, I talked about the Alpina ad, which is a great example. The watch here is helping the guy. You see this very powerful imagery, wilderness, an icy lake, and the guy has to do a what looks like very important job. And it's not like it would be impossible for him to do his diving without the watch. But the watch here is clearly a companion or a tool. It's a little bit like the Sam to his Frodo. Some watchmakers do try to improve their marketing towards women, and I feel with the trend of celebrity watch ambassadors that also include professionals from all sorts of industries, it's definitely a step into the right direction because it does showcases different female careers, but personally I say that there is still much room for improvement. Right, so now we know the history of the wristwatch, how it developed over time, and how watch adverts mostly reflected and oftentimes still reflect a very specific female and male image. We can summarize those findings and apply them to a very simple psychological model to answer the question why this hobby appears to be a male-dominated one. And let me quickly clear something up before we head into part 3. I don't think you have to necessarily own a watch to be a watch enthusiast, and same goes for cars, for example. You can be a huge sports car fan without owning one, but as I mentioned in the beginning, the watch hobby is a very particular one. Owning and or buying a watch is a huge part of it. So to answer the questions of all questions why women don't like watches, we can simply look at the psychology behind making a buying decision and include everything we have learned so far. There are tons of models that describe the buying decision in more or less depth, but for the sake of cognitive fluency, because that's what we human animals like, we are taking a look at this one. Let's look at step number 1, need recognition. So we basically notice that there is a problem that needs to be fixed or a need that we want to satisfy. In the past, a woman didn't necessarily need a watch as her career options were rather limited. Later on, it became something you got gifted as a woman. Watch adverts for ladies' watches were targeted at men, reflecting that apparently there isn't really a woman out there in need of a watch, but rather in need of a nice present. It was up to the man to buy his wife a watch, and nowadays many watch brands communicate that their watches are an accessory to a conventionally attractive female. The watch isn't a tool, the watch isn't really helpful, but it sure as hell looks good with the perfect outfit. So if you can identify with that, you might consider buying a watch. So in case you decide to get yourself a watch, you start to look for information. You quickly realize that there are certain watch brands that do stick out, the popular ones, and you hop onto their website, you browse through their catalog, and you notice that the collection at most brands is significantly smaller for their designated ladies' watches. The watches you find are mostly smaller, adorned with all sorts of diamonds, oftentimes made from precious metals and therefore insanely expensive. Compared to men's watches, you have to spend more on average getting smaller watches, oftentimes quartz movement, with cases much less durable. And then you start to evaluate your options. You find other brands, perhaps fashion brands you have heard of. There's a big selection of Gucci watches, for example. They got a lot to choose from. Some designs are definitely more masculine. You get to see all different shapes and sizes, and they cost less. And then you make your buying decision. You either found a watch that fits your budget and your preferences, or you don't. I mean, sure, you can understand how not everyone wants to wear a blingy, iced out and tiny watch on a day-to-day basis. Thankfully, women and men have much more freedom in terms of clothing now, so you may go for a fashion watch because they're much more to your liking because of the unisex design. And here it goes. You bought a watch that works for your everyday life as you work and do the jobs other people, such as men, are also doing, and you got a watch that helps you to tell the time. It often might not be a mechanical watch or considered a luxury watch, but it works just fine for you. And here you have it. The statement or question of why women don't like watches has been wrong all along. I think it should rather say, here's why most women don't like the watches that you like. Because women like watches. Women wear watches. The majority of us, a huge market that has so much potential, just has never been correctly communicated to by the watch industry, simply because preferences such as hobbies or things we buy are learned. Both genders subconsciously learn what they are supposed to like, and that's how we end up here. All these fashion brands like Daniel Wellington are such a huge success with women because they understood the market potential and that the message had to change accordingly. Yes, a watch can be a fashion accessory, but nowadays we also wear it to actually use it. And that's why not every woman actually wants to wear dainty little gold watches, but also all the other watches too. Women are no longer forced to portray themselves as fragile, ultra-feminine little beings. We have moved past that a long time ago. But somehow, most ladies' watches didn't quite caught up with that yet. And so here are my 2 cents. By no means am I saying that it's not right to like smaller watches with diamonds on them if you're female. I'm saying that I want to see more variety added to those ladies' watches that already exist. Dear watch brands, show me how a watch makes me more powerful and not how it makes me sexy. There are many brands out there which are already doing a great job at that, and I'm very optimistic that the rest of the industry is going to catch up soon too. And so here we have it, why women don't like watches, or rather why most women don't like the watches you do, and how we got here. I could talk about this topic for hours and still not be able to cover all things, but I hope this is a good starting point for a discussion. So what are your thoughts on this? If you're a lady watching this, how did you see things from your perspective? If you are a male watch enthusiast, how do you experience the discussion? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, that was it. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have enjoyed this, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.